This is Brian Simmons. Welcome to Module 10 of Interpersonal Communication. And in Module 10, we begin talking about the research on how smartphones, text messages, and other kinds of social media can be seen as a form of interpersonal communication. And we start with Module 10, Social Media as Interpersonal Communication. Well, it should come as no surprise that perhaps the most significant advance in interpersonal communication in the last 20 years has been the advent of text messages, social media, and other kinds of what's called electronically mediated communication. And so the research we're going to look at is more recent than the research we've seen previously. Or to put it differently, we've had many more years to study things like gender communication and interpersonal conflict than we have social media, text messages, and electronically mediated communication. That said, there are still some statements we can make with a great deal of certainty. Or to put it differently, there are some things we seem to know for certain about how social media, text messages, and other kinds of electronically mediated communication function as interpersonal communication. As we talk about all this, we'll be drawing on your experiences, but we'll also have to make a distinction between certain kinds of electronically mediated communication. Text messages, as a form of communication, are different than social media. And even within social media, certain platforms are different from one another. Obviously, things like TikTok and video-based formats are different than things like Facebook or Instagram or other kinds of formats. And so we begin with the research of someone named Sherry Turkle. Turkle wrote an interesting book based upon her research, and she draws an analogy that I and many researchers find very helpful to understand in a broad way how the smartphone and other kinds of social media act as a kind of overarching metaphor in the way they manage interpersonal communication. Sherry Turkle calls the smartphone a genie. And the reason why she focuses on the smartphone is because that device serves as a conduit for many kinds of electronically mediated communication into our lives. If you think about it, the smartphone you might hold in your hand, even right now, is a way for you to access all sorts of platforms. You can access Instagram or Facebook. You can text your friends. You can watch videos. You can communicate via video. You can Skype or do Zoom meetings or some other kind of thing. And so Turkle wants to say that the focus ought not be necessarily on certain platforms or even on different modes of communication, like text messages versus Skype or something. Instead, Turkle believes it's the device itself. It's the portability, the mobility, the sheer ubiquity of the smartphone that we should be focusing on. And so I start with Turkle because her way of seeing the device is a rather different way than what many people have used to try and study interpersonal communication. So in Turkle's research, there are 4 ways that she believes that the smartphone acts as a kind of genie. Remember, in all the ancient Arab parables, the genie is this mystical creature that is able to grant wishes, and it typically brings benefits into our lives. The genie comes out of the bottle and is your servant. And so by analogy, Turkle believes that your smartphone is a kind of genie. Specifically, the 4 things that Turkle says are these. First, she said the genie grants us the wish of always being heard. At any point of the day or night, you can go online, and you can go to Twitter, or you can go to Instagram, or you can write a blog post. You can find some way to have your opinions and your voice known. So Turkle is not as much interested in whether Twitter is negative or positive. She's not interested in the possibility of emails flaming, that is to say, saying things in the email that are provocative and emotional without a filter. Instead, Turkle simply says the smartphone gives you the opportunity to make your voice heard. Now, never mind the fact that your voice might get lost in the cacophony of other voices out there on social media. The mere fact that you can be heard is important. And Turkle says this is an extension of previous years where people would have to write graffiti on walls or have to stand on a soapbox in a public square to have a verbal opinion shared. So for Turkle, the smartphone offers you the opportunity for voice in a more far-ranging and a more accessible manner than any other kind of technology in the history of humankind. Second, Turkle argues that the smartphone acts as a genie because it allows us to put our attention wherever we want it. So for example, if you're on a date and the date isn't going well, you can discreetly turn your cell phone over and take a look at it and check your social media feed. That means the smartphone allows you to direct your attention to that phone or to other individuals that are posting on social media and not have to pay attention to the person you're talking to on your date. You might have seen this oftentimes if you've gone to some kind of a cashier and the person in front of you is trying to do a business transaction with the cashier, but at the same time that person is trying to do something on his or her smartphone. And so that becomes a way for you to control where your attention goes. Another way this manifests itself is oftentimes I've been in various restaurants and I've looked over at a table and I've seen a couple of parents and a couple of kids, and the two parents are not talking to the kids or to each other. Each parent instead has their head down looking at their cell phone, looking to see what's going on with sports scores or videos or the news or social media posts. And so it allows us to direct our attention where we want it. Now, obviously, before the smartphone came to be, we could easily direct our attention wherever we wanted to. At that restaurant, the husband could be looking over the wife's shoulder and watching television on the big screen behind her, or you could be staring at your plate. It's not as if the first time we ever decided we couldn't give our attention to someone is because we now had a smartphone in our hand. But Turkle argues that what the smartphone does is exacerbate or make worse this basic tendency to want to divert our attention away from the people we're in conversation with in a given moment. The third way that the smartphone acts as a genie in Turkle's research is that the smartphone grants us the wish that we will never have to be alone. Think about the number of people you've known that simply can't stand to sit quietly and give their attention to something other than that smartphone in their hand. There are people who, when you walk away from them, the first thing to do is check their email or go to social media to see what's going on. They can't just sit quietly and wait for you to return, for example, from the restroom to resume your conversation. And so Turkle argues that the smartphone allows us the sense that, the comforting feeling that we will never be alone. And Turkle thinks that's an important consideration. If you go on a long trip and you're driving by yourself, you don't have to worry about breaking down in the middle of nowhere because that smartphone allows you a connection to help if it has to come. You are truly never alone. And finally, number 4, Turkle believes that the smartphone grants us the wish of never being bored because we can always find something to do with the smartphone in our hand. And so the idea of having to stand in line and wait for your turn to come to the front of a queue no longer has to be miserable because if you're at the mailbox, or the post office rather, or the DMV or some other place where you have to stand in line, all you have to do is open up your smartphone and you're never, ever bored. So with this as a backdrop, Turkle wants to point to the very basic notion of the appliance itself influencing interpersonal communication. And frankly, that's a very different way of looking at interpersonal communication than the gender communication or the conflict research we've talked about previously. Because the gender communication research focuses on the people involved in the communication. The conflict research focuses on the context or what the driving or overarching theme of the interaction is. For Turkle, the focus when it comes to social media is on the vehicle that brings the content into our lives. So having talked about Turkle's idea of a genie as kind of a backdrop to the research, let me share with you several different lenses that researchers have used to try and understand how social media and other forms of electronically mediated communication influence interpersonal communication. The first idea is what's called social presence theory. Social presence theory wants to focus on the idea that there's something happening when people are interacting with one another that needs to be explained. And so social presence theory argues that the greater number of message cues you have, the more the impression is received that that other person is present in the moment. So right now, you're looking at this screen. You're seeing my face, you're seeing my gestures, you're hearing my voice. You're hearing the tone of my voice. Hopefully you can gauge in that tone that it's a rather measured, hopefully confident, knowledgeable kind of a tone. But you can't smell me. You can't necessarily see if I'm sweating or not, which I'm not, and I think I smell okay. You can't see what's below me, and I promise that I've got dress pants on and dress shoes, but the fact of the matter is there are fewer cues in this form of interaction than if you and I were together in a classroom on the campus of Oklahoma Christian University. Here, you can't tell what the temperature in the room is, other than the temperature in the room where you are, but we don't share that temperature. And so the idea then is that right now there are more limited social cues, more limited communicative cues in this interaction than there would be if you and I were in the classroom. And so therefore, what social presence theory wants to do is look at how certain forms of electronically mediated communication are either rich or less rich when it comes to these message cues. So as you might imagine, a Skype phone call has more social presence to it than do text messages, because by definition, text messages only have text. And while we might embed emojis or other kinds of things into those messages to try and convey more richness, the fact of the matter is they'll still always be lacking. And as you might have noticed during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were shunted into doing classes in an online nature, they were doing Zoom meetings and Google Hangout meetings and things like that, you might have noticed initially that it wasn't as rich. And so if that experience is at all relevant in your life, then you've already experienced in some manner what social presence theory is talking about. And so therefore, what this theory wants to do is it wants to look at how certain forms of mediated communication try and overcome the lack of social presence. It also wants to look at how people will do their best with limited social presence to make relationships work. So for example, later on in this course, we'll talk about the research on long-distance relationships. And when we get there, I'll tell you about the research on how people use text messages and Skype and other forms of mediated communication to try and compensate for the fact that they're not interacting with each other in a one-to-one basis. One person who has written about this social presence theory is Jean Twenge. Now, we'll look at Twenge's research in various areas as we work through the overall research about social media. But for now, let me say this about one aspect of Twenge's research because I think it bears on social presence theory. Twenge wants to do what's called cohort analysis. So for example, she wants to look at teenagers today and compare them to teenagers 30 years ago, and compare those teenagers to teenagers 30 years before that. And so what she wants to do is to look at how different people at different ages over time have interacted with one another. And one of the things that she finds is that ever since the introduction of Apple's iPhone, almost 20 years ago now, we find that teenagers spend less time interacting face-to-face than did their parents when their parents were teenagers, and less time interacting face-to-face than their grandparents did when they were teenagers. And so it's partly a generational thing, but more than that, really, it is looking at how teenagers at a certain point in time are interacting. And Twenge says it's no coincidence that this sudden decrease in the amount of face-to-face interactions coincides with the release of Apple's iPhone. And from there, what's called the penetration rate, meaning the diffusion of smartphones across the population, whether they're Apple, Android, or anything else, that as that diffused out into the broader population, we found teenagers interacting even less on a face-to-face basis. Now, later we'll talk about the research about how this could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. Twenge simply wants to note that there's some relationship between more people carrying smartphones around and a decrease in the amount of interactions face-to-face, at least with respect to teenagers. Now, Lawrence Sherman is another researcher who's also looked at social presence theory and how that fits in to interpersonal communication. And one of the things he finds is that people who interact with people in person feel emotionally closer to those people than when they interact with the same people through social media. That probably comes as no big surprise, but Sherman chalks that up to social presence theory. Or to put it differently, his research finds that interactions that are mediated, whether they're text messages, Skype calls, social media posts, whatever, those interactions are not as rich and are not experienced as rich, and people don't feel as connected and close to one another. Now, I've experienced this myself during the COVID-19 pandemic. The small group Bible study that I and my wife are a part of had to meet via Zoom for several weeks during the early portions of that pandemic. But then as some of the restrictions began to loosen later in the spring, we began to meet 6 feet apart in chairs in a circle in one person's backyard. And even though we were 6 feet apart and we were practicing the approved social distancing measures, just the fact that we were together in the backyard, hearing the bugs and the birds, feeling the grass at our feet, all experiencing the same warm temperatures, being able to look at other people and what's beyond them, it created a richer, different experience. And as social presence theory would predict, we felt closer to one another and all talked about how great it was to be together. That's social presence theory. And so what we find then is that the flip side of this is that when you don't feel as emotionally close to someone, you tend to have more friction. And in fact, that's true not just with face-to-face interactions, but more recent research has found it's true with mediated interactions as well. And so one of the more common research findings is that when people communicate extensively via social media, they're more likely to have some kind of friction. So friction can be a communicative misunderstanding. It can be the fact that you're misinterpreting the social cues. It can be more superficial exchanges. Anything like that oftentimes creates what's called friction. So friction is not the same thing as conflict, though it could lead to tension and conflict. Friction instead is just this dissatisfaction, this awkwardness or unevenness that comes from communication, typically because those message cues we talked about are not as rich. Now, one offshoot of this is research that wants to look at whether everyone is equally affected by this social presence in the same way. So, for example, you may know some people in your life that are a little more shy, people that are a little more prone to wanting to be by themselves. Well, Steve Kaplan has done some research specifically on people that are socially disconnected. Sometimes these are people that are shy, but not always. But people that are socially disconnected are people that would say, I'm lonely. They tend to have fewer friends. They tend to feel as if they don't have a sense of place on their campus or at their church or at the place where they work. They're kind of loners. Or alternatively, they just feel lonely. They haven't been somewhere long enough to make connection, or they're just finding it hard to make connection. And so what Kaplan finds is that people that fall into this category of being lonely, they actually show a preference for online social interaction. Well, that makes sense because if you're feeling lonely, the online interaction is a way to connect with less work and less risk than might be present in a face-to-face interaction. But the problem is that in Kaplan's research, this actually exacerbates or increases their loneliness because those online interactions are more artificial because they're not as socially rich. And so Kaplan wants to say that on the one hand, we might imagine there being benefit to people that are lonely because these mediated interactions create the opportunity for more interaction, particularly with people you might not know as well. The problem is when people do this, they come to realize that the differences and the lack of quality between face-to-face interactions and online interactions creates a situation where they feel worse about themselves. So all of that just kind of fits under the umbrella of social presence theory. Now, a second lens through which to see the research on social media is what's called hyper-personal theory. Jack Walther is the researcher who has pioneered research into hyper-personal theory. And it's a very simple idea. His argument is that electronically mediated communication actually accelerates the development of closeness by increasing both the breadth and the depth of self-disclosure, and by offering the opportunity for more frequent interactions. It's called hyper-personal because for Walther, the online interactions allow us to communicate more frequently and allow us to open up earlier than we might in face-to-face interactions. So let's give a simple example. Let's say that a guy and a girl meet on campus at Oklahoma Christian. Now, after that meeting, it's possible for them to continue to talk face-to-face. They might have lunch in the branch a couple of days, or they might go out on a date a couple of nights a week. But in between those face-to-face interactions, they can do a lot of texting back and forth. They can Instagram one another through DMs or whatever. And so the sheer quantity of interaction between this guy and this girl is likely to be far greater than it would have been when I was in college. Because when I was in college, if you didn't see someone face to face, you had to call them on a landline, which obviously is more difficult, more awkward. You can't speak with someone typically for as long a period of time and might not be able to get them to answer the landline at the time you want them to. And so compared to when I was dating, when I was in college, there were far fewer interactions of a face-to-face or of a mediated variety. But today, that hypothetical guy and girl can not only have the in-person interactions, but beyond that, those electronically mediated interactions, the DMs, the text messages, and all that kind of thing. So what Walther argues is the sheer quantity creates a situation where people are disclosing. That is to say, they're talking about a broader range of topics. Maybe they're having deeper conversations, but they're doing so in terms of timeline earlier in that relationship than they otherwise would. And by the way, although hyperpersonal theory has been found to be particularly true in romantic relationships, it's also been found to be true in other contexts where people simply share something in common. So if you think about discussion groups, message boards, other kinds of situations where people share a common interest, people surviving cancer, for example, or people going through dialysis, then what you find is that people that have a strong sense of what's in common, they oftentimes develop close connections in a mediated fashion far more quickly than they otherwise would in a face-to-face fashion. So hyperpersonal theory also fits into what's been called the disinhibition effect. This is John Suhler. Suhler's research looks into how it is that people who use electronically mediated communication loosen up. They express themselves more openly. they feel, because of the relative anonymity or because of the perceived safety of the screen, that they can say things that are more open and honest and blunt and unfiltered and raw than they might in other situations. Now, of course, that can lead to negativity, and it can lead to being an off-putting kind of thing for many people. But his argument is that this kind of unfiltered nature allows us to get a clearer glimpse of people at an earlier point in time, and this in turn creates the hyperpersonal theory that we talked about a moment ago. So to understand the relationship between the disinhibition effect and hyperpersonal theory is to say that the disinhibition effect creates a climate whereby the hyperpersonal theory that Walther talks about can be enacted. You may have experienced this in your own life by using dating apps or by using other kinds of social media-based platforms. But for people like Suhler and people like Walther, this is rather different than what used to happen years ago. And so the research has to be continued to find out what happens when an entire generation, your generation, for example, grows up doing this kind of a thing. So focusing narrowly on teenagers, there's one more researcher I want to talk about. His name is Y.T. Uhls, U-H-L-S. Uhls argues that there is some research that finds that among young teenagers, so we're talking 13, 14, 15-year-old people, that those young teenagers who use less social media actually have stronger in-person social skills than do those young teenagers that are heavy users of social media. Or to put it differently, if you've got Bobby and Johnny, two 14-year-old boys, and if Bobby doesn't make much use of social media, he's not DMing people, he's not texting a lot of people, he's not TikTok videos, he's just kind of dipping his toe in that pool. And you've got Johnny, the other boy, who does a lot of that. Chances are, all things being equal, that Bobby will have better in-person social skills. He'll be better able to hold a conversation, better able to interact with adults, better able to manage the kinds of day-to-day interactions you might see. And that, according to Y.T. Uhls, is because people get used to an environment where people are communicating in a mediated fashion, and so the rules or the etiquette or the way that one does interactions in that form doesn't translate to what happens in a face-to-face form. And so people like Johnny become so comfortable, so imbued with how to interact in that mediated environment, those skills simply don't transfer to a face-to-face environment. Whereas for Bobby, who's not as deeply involved in social media, he's able to develop those face-to-face interaction skills, which is quite helpful. Now, related to all this, both hyperpersonal theory and the idea of social presence theory, is this notion of how it is people understand what's going on in terms of the content of that. And so now we talk about what's called social information processing theory. Kind of a long term, but let me explain what's going on. Social information processing theory argues that communicators are actually clever, that they can make spontaneous adjustments to the environments in which they're in. So to go back to Bobby and Johnny, I said earlier that Uhls finds research that Johnny might not be able to translate the social skills that he has in the online interactions to the face-to-face interactions. Well, social information processing theory comes along and says, well, that's not necessarily the case. That the more mature you get, as both Johnny and Bobby become 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30 years old, that we are able to process the information differently. So what happens is that for social information processing theory, the argument is that the older we get, the more we develop the maturation and the skills, therefore, to be able to become chameleons, to be able to follow the rules of online interaction when we're texting, when we're involved in social media, but to follow a different set of rules when it comes to face-to-face interactions. And so for people with social information processing theory, the argument goes that we will, in a sense, outgrow this one-dimensional, I'm only good at communicating online kind of a thing. Now, one neat thing about social information processing theory is that it holds out the hope that people actually are more adept than we think they are. Or to put it differently, that you can't necessarily look at how there's a static, never-changing way that people will communicate, but that instead people are able to communicate in different contexts in different ways. We're actually that smart. So social information processing theory is really rather helpful. Now, having talked about all of this, let's talk about one more idea that I think is rather important. We have looked specifically at how social media influences friendships, and we do this because we find that social media tends to occur far more in a friendship context than virtually any other. The people you tend to follow, the people you tend to keep up with, the people you tend to care the most about, the people who make up the news feed in your social media platform are typically people you have some connection to. Now, obviously not all of them, because you can follow some celebrity on Twitter and things like that. But at the end of the day, for most of us, the people that inhabit our online world are more or less people we've already connected with. They are, in essence, in our orbit. So one of the things that we find is that extensive use of social media ends up reinforcing our friendships. But more than that, it ends up reinforcing our views of ourselves, our views of the world. So what we find, for example, is that there's research that finds the greater you make use of social media, the more likely you are to hold deeply and to firmly entrench the political, the social, the moral, and the religious views that you have. This in part is because most of the people that we're communicating with tend to have the similar kind of views that we do. Now, we'll talk more about that when we get to the friendship research. But for now, just grab a hold of the idea that extensive use of various kinds of social media reinforces the views we have of ourselves and the views we have of our world. And so the idea then is that for many people, this reinforces things rather than opening our minds to what might be different. Related to that is one more piece of research. And that research argues that oftentimes people that are involving themselves in communication with their friends through social media, that they find the same kind of support, the same kind of validation, the same kind of presence of friendship in the online interactions as they do the face-to-face interactions. Now, this is particularly true for young people, that is to say for teenagers and emerging adults. It's less true for people as you move into your 30s and 40s and beyond. But generally speaking, if we're talking about younger human beings, those human beings tend to feel that they get just as much out of the interactions with their friends via social media as they do their face-to-face interactions. They say they feel emotionally close to them, they feel that they're supported, they feel as if their friendship continues on. And I conclude this module with that research because I want to use that as a way of saying this. The research into how social media affects communication and relationships and things of that nature is relatively recent. Because it's such young research, we haven't had the opportunity to study it from as many different angles. We haven't had the opportunity to replicate it. We haven't had the opportunity to see how it works and all of its nooks and crannies and nuance. And so the statements we can make about it are necessarily very subtle, tentative statements. I said earlier in this class there's always a tension between universality and idiosyncrasy. We're moving closer toward universality by being able to say things like I've talked about in this module, but there's still a great deal of idiosyncrasy, and there's also a great deal we just don't know. So what I want to do in the next module is talk a little bit more about the research on interpersonal communication as it relates to social media and electronically mediated communication, and I'll share with you more of what we do feel that we know about how those two are related.